Why is it that some people who go through truly horrific life experiences still possess some sense of gratitude and joy? This question became something of an obsession for me early in my career as a reporter, first in the early 1980s for a radio station in Seattle, and then in the late 80s and into the mid-90s in a TV station in Spokane. This was a time when many, many people who had survived World War II were beginning to speak openly and sometimes very, very graphically about what they experienced. Now, out of the dozens and dozens of people I both interviewed and talked to about their experiences during the Second World War, there are two stories that truly stand out, and I think help answer this question of how is it possible for someone who has been so mistreated and neglected to still feel the sense of joy and gratitude. They're two people of the same generation, of different genders, in vastly different corners of the world, who had a similar experience and a very, very similar viewpoint on life at the end of the Second World War. So the first of these two stories starts on a slow news day in a TV newsroom in Spokane. And what I learned working in television on a slow news day, what you typically do is pick up a copy of the local newspaper and hope there's some disaster story that you can say, could it happen here? So on this particular slow news day, I picked up the Spokesman Review, and there's a story with a banner headline that reads, "Killer bees invade Southern California." Hey, I got a story. All I have to do is ask the question, could killer bees come to the Pacific Northwest? Piece of cake. Picked up the phone book, I looked up a beekeeper, and I found Tate's Honey Farm on Marengo Drive. I called Wes Tate, I arranged to meet Mr. Tate, and my photographer, Neil, and I got into our white news van, and we drove out to Marengo Drive. Wes greeted us, he shook my hand. Neil, my photographer, walked around the back of the van, and Wes looked at him and said, "Are you Chinese or Japanese?" And I thought, oh my God, what have I gotten us into? This guy's a bigot. What are we doing here? Well, my friend Neil very graciously answered and said, well, my grandparents came from Japan, but I'm like you, I'm an American. At which point, Wes responded by saying, well, I spent 4 years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. You want to talk about awkward silence? I was absolutely frozen. I did not know what to do or say. Neil excused himself to go get a piece of equipment out of our van, and I asked Wes, I said, does it bother you at all that Neil is of Japanese ancestry? Oh my gosh, no, are you kidding? Those people saved my life. I asked him to explain. Well, in the weeks and months that followed the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan turned its attention to the Philippines, specifically an island called Corregidor, where Wes Tate and many thousands of other Americans were essentially trapped. Wes told me that after they had captured and eaten every rat, every snake, and every monkey they could find on that island, they finally had to surrender for a lack of food. Within a very short time, he found himself as part of another historic event. It was called the Bataan Death March. He said the most notable memory of that experience was watching many of his friends who were sick or weak falling by the side of the road and their execution with a single thrust of a bayonet. Wes said it was a real motivator to just keep moving. Eventually, he found himself as forced labor in a chemical plant in northern Japan, and by this time, he had a horrific case of malaria. He would shake uncontrollably. Well, one day, he was approached by the civilian manager of this chemical plant. A Japanese civilian came up and motioned for him to follow. There was a language barrier, and so Wes just followed. He followed the man to a room where there was a very large industrial boiler that was just pouring out the heat. And this man had set out a futon on the ground and motioned to Wes, "You, sleep. Come, sleep." Well, after many weeks and months of neglect and torment, Wes Tate could not believe his good fortune. A simple act of human kindness, a bed in a warm place. Wes said he quickly laid down and fell asleep. It didn't last very long. A couple of moments later, he felt the kick of a boot in his side, and he looked up and he saw the guard, the Japanese soldier who was assigned to keep him working. Wes said he didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. Get up and get back to work. The soldier motioned, get up. Wes said he did some quick calculations in his mind. He said he felt so sick and so tired that he concluded at that moment that there was nothing that guard could do to him that was worse than what he was already living through. So he just closed his eyes. Well, that made that guard really mad. He kicked Wes again very hard and screamed at him in Japanese and motioned, get up, get up. Wes opened his eyes, looked at him, and said, I'm done. I don't care what you do, I'm done. And he simply closed his eyes. At which point, that guard was now fully enraged. Wes said he could hear the sound, the very distinct metallic sound of a bayonet coming off a soldier's utility belt, and he could hear it click on the end of a rifle. He peeled back his eyelids, and he saw that soldier plant his feet and pull that bayonet back. Wes Tate knew he was about to be executed. And he prayed to God to please take me from here. God, take me now. Take me now, God. Please take me. And at just the moment he was certain that bayonet was going to pierce his chest, he heard another voice screaming off in the distance. And the voice was getting closer and closer and louder and louder. And when he finally opened his eyes, it was that civilian factory manager, the man who laid out the futon. He was standing in front of the bayonet screaming at the soldier. I have absolutely no idea what that man said to the soldier, Wes told me. But the soldier never bothered me again. I have no love for the Imperial Army of Japan, but the Japanese people saved my life. I'm absolutely convinced that our rather awkward conversation with my friend and photographer Neil was just one more attempt to say thank you to somebody from Japan. A couple of years later, my boss asked me to do a story about the 50th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. And I thought it would be really interesting to tell this story from the perspective of someone who was awaiting liberation. So I called the Temple Beth Shalom in Spokane. I talked to Rabbi Jack Isaacson, and I asked Rabbi Jack, are there any members of your congregation who were survivors of the Holocaust? A couple of days later, my photographer and I were at the home of Eva Lassman. I really believe that if any of us here were to meet this woman, your immediate conclusion would, I want her to be my grandmother. Petite, warm, radiant smile, wire-framed glasses, white permed hair, and the most gracious, welcoming manner. Please come into my home. We set up our camera, we set up our lights. I flipped on the camera and asked her that question. What were you doing in June of 1944? Well, Eva Lassman's story starts in Poland in the late 1930s when she and her family were forced into the Warsaw Ghetto. Her family died there, and she was sent off to a forced labor camp. She said the camp was most memorable for having a large parade ground. There were the commandant's offices and the administrative offices, and then in the center of the parade ground was a large gallows. And she said that their captors would routinely call all the prisoners together, and they would just grab someone out of the crowd, anybody, randomly, tie their hands behind their back, and as that person begged for their life, please somebody save me, they would be dragged up the stairs, and a rope would be put around their neck, and they would be hanged until they were dead. Eva and all the other prisoners had to watch. They had to continue watching because that person's remains would be left up for a week or more as a warning of what would happen to you if you tried to escape or if you somehow stepped out of line. Eva told me she survived because she was flawless. That was the one smile I got out of her. She said that one day she was called into the commandant's office. They were looking for a girl to clean the administrative offices and the commandant's office. She went into the commandant's office and she was instructed to take her clothes off. She did as she was told. She was inspected by the camp commandant and said, "You'll do." So what was the job qualification? She didn't have any surgical scars. That was it. So she was now able to clean the commandant's office and the administrative offices, which saved her life, because she was able to scavenge food out of the garbage cans. It kept her and a couple of her friends alive. She said it was enough food on a regular enough basis that she believes somebody in that office was leaving food for her intentionally. She said one of the most puzzling things about the Holocaust and about being in this particular forced labor camp was that it really seemed her captors hated each other. She said one day a sergeant went in to talk to the commandant. The door closed, and she could very quickly hear an argument, a loud argument, which turned into a physical fight. She could hear furniture moving and breaking, and then she could hear a man scream, "No, please, no, please, no!" And then there was silence. Within a couple of seconds, two soldiers went in and dragged out the dead sergeant by the heels of his boots, leaving a wide trail of blood on the floor. "Clean it up," the commandant barked at Eva. She got her bucket and her sponge. She entered the commandant's office and was stunned. She was shocked at the surrealistic scene. She said, up and down the walls and the ceiling, everywhere you looked, there was blood splatter everywhere, up and down the walls. She said the only possible explanation is that that man was beaten to death with a club, and that every time he hit him, it became soaked in blood, and the blood went flying everywhere. And it's at this point I'm trying to hold it together, because I can see it all. I can see the humiliation and the suffering and the loss that this beautiful human being experienced. And I could see Wes Tate in his near execution, and I thought, how can we do this to each other? How can we do this to people? But at this point, I just don't want to break down crying in this beautiful human being's living room. I've got to wrap this up. I got a great story. I got to leave. And all I could think to say was, how are you not filled with rage and hatred for what these people did to you? And she cut me off. I didn't even get to finish my question. She said, Steve, that's easy. It's because you cannot hate and live. And I choose to live for all those who did not. Justice, yes. Hatred, I have no room for that. Eva met the man who would become her husband in a settlement camp after the war. They were sponsored by the Temple Beth Shalom, where they raised a family. One of her sons went on to be an officer in the United States Navy. And it was from Eva and from Wes that I think I found the answer to my question. How is it that we as human beings can suffer terrible things and still have a radiant sense of gratitude? Well, it's easy. Those are the people who choose life. Thank you very much.